Welcome back to our channel. The laughter echoed in the room, light-hearted at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Everyone seemed to be in on the joke, their eyes flicking between me and her. My wife leaned back, her smile wide, and then she said it, casually, like it was nothing. "I control his money, so he'll never leave." Her words hung in the air, sharp and biting. It wasn't a joke anymore. Not really. The room fell silent for a split second, before it erupted again, the kind of laughter that cuts deep, the kind that doesn't just entertain, but mocks, humiliates. Her family, my in-laws, people I'd spent holidays with, birthdays, and countless dinners, were laughing like I was the punchline to some grand joke. I sat there, frozen for a second, while they carried on, oblivious to the weight of what was happening. Her words didn't feel like a declaration of control, they felt like a sentence. A reminder of my place in this marriage, in this family. It wasn't the first time I had felt like an outsider in my own life, but this moment, it pierced through every ounce of pride I thought I had left. The casual ease with which she said it, the way her family just accepted it as truth, like it was a known fact that I had no say in my own life. I looked around at the faces, the smiles, the eyes that gleamed with some kind of sadistic amusement. They didn't even see me as a person anymore. I wasn't a partner to her, I was a joke. A puppet. And I sat there, quietly. Not a word. Not a look. I didn't react. Her laughter was just the beginning. It was the trigger. But at that moment, I made a decision. Not one I would voice, but one I would act on. I would stay silent for now. Let them laugh. But only because they had no idea who they were laughing at. I had lived in this marriage for years, without realizing how deep the roots of control had sunk. It was always small things at first, her making decisions about money, then the house, then the plans. I convinced myself it was just part of the dynamic, that it was her strength balancing my weaknesses. But in reality, it was control. Stealthy, calculated. I wasn't blind to it. I had known for a while, but the realization hadn't hit me like this. Not until she made that statement. That small slip of the tongue that revealed everything I had been too comfortable to confront. I thought back to the countless times I had agreed to her ideas, her plans, simply because it felt easier than arguing. How many times had I told myself it wasn't worth the fight? How many times had I let her make the decisions, believing that everything was fine as long as I didn't rock the boat? But as I sat there, enduring their laughter, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger yet. Not entirely. It was more like a slow, creeping awareness. Awareness that I had been living in the shadows of someone else's will for far too long. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't some passive player in this drama. But I realized, for the first time, that I had been living like one. She had taken the reins, and I had handed them over willingly, out of complacency, out of fear, out of some misguided belief that love meant surrender. But love wasn't control. Not like this. Not this prison she had built around me. And in the silence that followed her proclamation, while they all kept laughing, I began to think about the next step. I had stayed quiet, yes. But only for now. Her control over me was so seamless, so ingrained in our daily life that I didn't even see it as control anymore. The money she managed, the decisions she made, how she planned everything. I thought that was just part of being in a relationship, being a team. I had justified it for so long. But this? This was manipulation. This was power. The funny thing is, I didn't even care about the money. Not really. It wasn't about that. It was about respect. It was about feeling like I had some say in my own life, in the direction of my own future. But as the laughter continued, something inside me hardened. They didn't know me. Not really. They didn't know the man sitting in that chair, quietly enduring their mockery. I had spent years listening to them, to her, thinking that this was just the way things were. Maybe I'd made excuses for her, for us. Maybe I thought love was about compromise, about giving up pieces of yourself for the other person. But this wasn't compromise. This was submission. This was power and control disguised as love. And in that moment, I decided to let them laugh. Let her think she was in charge. Because I knew something she didn't. I wasn't trapped. I was biding my time. Waiting. And when the time came, it would be me who had the last laugh. The days following that moment at the family gathering were like a fog rolling in, heavy, suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. No matter how many times I tried to go about my routine, to pretend that nothing had changed, the words lingered in the back of my mind, like a soundtrack to every decision I made. I control his money, so he'll never leave. The more I replayed them, the more I felt a rising tide of frustration building inside me. I wasn't mad, not at first. I wasn't even sure I was angry. But I was disgusted. It wasn't the control itself that bothered me so much. I had let that happen. I had allowed her to make decisions for us, to manage the finances, to steer the direction of our lives. But it was the way she said it. The way she flaunted it. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration of ownership. And in that moment, she had reduced me to a possession. A thing. As I drove home that night, her voice echoed in my head, growing louder, more insistent. I kept telling myself that it wasn't a big deal. That it was just one careless comment. That I didn't need to make a mountain out of a molehill. But deep down, I knew it was something bigger. Something I couldn't ignore anymore. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I took a moment to assess everything. I'd always been the kind of person who went along with things. The kind of person who avoided confrontation and let the people around him take charge. I had convinced myself that it was okay to let her handle the finances, that it was fine if she made the big decisions, that I could focus on my job and everything else would just fall into place. But now, I couldn't unsee it. I was tired of being complacent. Tired of being the background character in my own life. What had I become? A spectator? A bystander? A yes man? All these years, I had let her run the show, believing it was easier that way. It was comfortable, wasn't it? Or at least, I thought it was. I had convinced myself that stepping back and letting her take the reins was a sign of love, of partnership. But I'd never stopped to ask myself if it was really a partnership. Or if it was just her having her way. Every single time that I had let this happen, I knew that. I had built the cage, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. Now, it was starting to feel like a prison. Not just the money, but the decisions, the direction of our lives, even the things I thought I wanted. She had become the architect of all of it. And it wasn't out of love anymore, it was out of control that I started to notice how much of my life had been dictated by her. Every financial decision, every major choice, everything we did, even where we went on vacation, was always her idea. Always her plan. She had a way of making everything seem like it was for us, like it was a joint effort. But now, I saw it clearly. I was just a passenger in my own life, a passenger with no say, no control. That I had always told myself that it didn't matter. I didn't mind letting her handle everything. After all, it made things easier, right? Or so I thought. But that was the lie I had been telling myself. That was the lie I had swallowed, and for far too long that I tried to focus on the present, but my thoughts kept drifting to the past. How many times had she made decisions without consulting me? How many times had I just nodded along, pretending it was all fine? And I never questioned it. I never spoke up. But now, looking back, it felt like I had given up every inch of myself, piece by piece, and I hadn't even realized it was happening. I wasn't stupid. I could see the power dynamic. The imbalance. It had been there, lurking in the background, disguised as her being organized or her taking care of things. But now, I understood. It wasn't about her being organized. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about control. As the days passed, the thought of this began to gnaw at me, pulling at my sense of self. The more I reflected on it, the more I realized how much of my own agency had been stripped away. And as painful as it was to admit, I knew I had allowed it to happen. I had let her dictate the narrative of our lives because it felt safer that way. It felt easier than challenging her. But now, I felt like I had lost myself. I had become a shell of the person I used to be. The person who used to make decisions, the person who had goals and dreams outside of this controlled existence. I had abandoned that person. And I had done it willingly. Every decision that I had allowed her to make for us, every moment I had let her call the shots, each one had chipped away at who I was. And the worst part was that I hadn't even noticed. It wasn't until that moment, at the dinner table, when her family laughed at me, that it finally hit me like a ton of bricks that I wasn't just living in a controlled environment, I was living in a lie. I started to think about my options. About what it would take to change things. I had let this happen, yes, but it wasn't too late. It wasn't too late to take back what I had lost. But the question was, how? How do you regain control of your life when you've handed over the reins so completely? How do you break free from something that has become so ingrained in every aspect of your existence? I knew it wasn't going to be easy. There would be consequences, for sure. It wouldn't just be about money. It would be about everything that I had allowed to slip away over the years, the respect, the power, the voice I had once had in this relationship. But I also knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to let her control me anymore. I wasn't going to let her treat me like I was her possession, like I was just another thing in her life that she could manipulate. It was time for a change. And so, I started to make a plan. Quietly. Slowly. I would take back control. But I knew it wouldn't be as simple as just stopping what she had built. It would take time, strategy, and careful thought. I began with small steps. The things she wouldn't notice right away. A bank account here, a small change there. Little things to regain some autonomy over my life. But I had to be careful. I couldn't rush this. It had to be done slowly, methodically. Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of a grip she truly had on everything. How deeply she had dug her claws into our life. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about getting back at her. But it was about me. About me taking back my power. And so, the journey began. But the real work was just starting. The first few days were the hardest. My mind raced, endlessly thinking of ways to regain what I had lost, to dismantle the control she had over me without causing a scene, without raising suspicion. Every move had to be calculated. Every word, every gesture, had to be carefully measured. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Not by a long shot. But I had no choice anymore. The silence, the quiet submission, it wasn't enough. I needed to find a way to take back what was rightfully mine. I started small. Too small for her to notice. Little things, things that I had never had control over before. The finances, the bills, the simple decisions that were always hers to make. The more I subtly shifted things, the more I could feel the power of taking those small steps. I would take control, piece by piece, until I had the strength to take back everything. The first step was the bank accounts. She had always handled the money, every dollar, every transaction, every bill paid, every purchase made. It was how she had kept her grip on everything. She always knew where we stood financially, and I always took her word for it. But now, I knew I had to create my own financial independence. I opened a separate account. A secret account. One she didn't know about. It felt almost criminal, like a betrayal. But that was the price of freedom, wasn't it? Betrayal felt like the only way forward, the only way to regain a sense of control. Every time I made a small transfer from the shared account to mine, a part of me felt lighter. But there was also a sense of dread, a constant fear of being caught, of having this plan shattered before it even had a chance to take root. The second step was the house. She had always made the decisions about where we lived, about the renovations, the decor, everything. I had never once questioned it. I had let her choose it all, thinking it didn't matter. I told myself that I wasn't interested in the details, that she had better taste, that it wasn't a big deal. But now I saw it for what it was, another method of control. I started taking an interest in things. I began researching properties on my own, looking at different options, and quietly setting aside money for potential investments. I wasn't planning on leaving yet, I still had to be careful, but I knew that one day, if things went the way I wanted, I would need to have options. I would need to be able to make decisions without her. To choose a path that wasn't dictated by her. She never suspected anything. Not at first. Every night, we would sit together, talk about our day, our plans, and she would continue with her narrative, the one she had carefully crafted, the one that made her the center of everything, the one that left no room for me to have a say. But now, I saw right through it. I saw how everything had been a performance, how every conversation had been crafted to keep me in my place. As the weeks passed, I grew bolder. I began making decisions on my own, small ones at first. I would choose what we had for dinner, or I would make plans for the weekend. Simple things. But to me, they felt like victories. Each time I took control of something, I felt the grip of her power loosening, just a little. It was like I was waking up from a long sleep, and every action I took was a step toward regaining the man I had once been. But there were also moments of doubt. Doubts that crept in late at night when I was alone with my thoughts. Was this really the right thing to do? Was I just being petty, trying to get back at her for something that was my fault too? I had let this happen. I had let her take the lead. I had made my own life smaller in the name of love and compromise. But now, every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. That I had become a shell of who I used to be. A man who had no voice, no opinions, no will of his own. And the worst part was that I had let it happen. I had allowed it for so long. But I couldn't turn back now. There was no going back to that quiet complacency. No going back to a life where I simply accepted the roles that had been assigned to me. And then there were the moments with her. The times when she'd ask me if I needed anything, if I was okay with the way things were. At first, I would nod and smile, telling her everything was fine. But now, every time she asked, I could see the subtle manipulations beneath her words. The way she would try to keep me in line, keep me under her thumb. But it was getting harder for her to do that. Because, inside, I was changing. I was no longer the man who would just nod along, who would let her make every decision. I had stopped hiding my own desires, my own needs. I had stopped pretending that I didn't want more freedom, more control, more of my life back. I knew there would come a time when I would have to confront her. It couldn't go on like this forever. But I wasn't ready for that yet. Not until I had built up enough of a foundation for myself. Not until I had the power to stand on my own, without relying on her for anything. I had to make sure that when I did confront her, I wasn't just a victim anymore. I wasn't just someone who had been complacent and let everything happen to him. I needed to be in control. I needed to be strong. In the meantime, I kept playing the part. I kept pretending that nothing was different. I kept going along with her plans, smiling when she smiled, laughing when she laughed. But inside, I was building my own future. One where I didn't need to ask for permission. One where I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to tear her down. I wanted freedom. And that was all I was after. I just needed to take control of my own life again. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that taking control wasn't just about the practical things, money, property, decisions. It was about my own sense of self. It was about waking up every day knowing that I had a choice, that I could live my life on my terms, not hers. And I would fight for that, no matter what. The first sign that things were shifting came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday morning, and she had just returned from her usual trip to the grocery store. She stood in the kitchen, unloading the bags with the kind of efficiency that I had grown accustomed to. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical. I used to admire it, how she always seemed to have everything under control. But now, standing there in the silence of our home, I saw it differently. It wasn't control, it was suffocating. She paused for a moment, glancing over at me. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, my usual coffee mug in hand, pretending to read the paper. But I wasn't really reading. I was watching her, trying to gauge what was happening. Trying to figure out what she would do next. "You're quiet today," she said, a subtle frown forming on her face. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated. It was a simple question, but the weight behind it felt suffocating. I could feel the shift in the air, the tension that had been building up for weeks. It wasn't just in me anymore. I could see it in her too. She didn't know what was happening, but she could sense it. I nodded, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." She didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she continued with her task, the silence between us growing thicker with each passing second. The tension was palpable, but I didn't know how to break it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to reveal what was coming, but as I sat there, something inside me shifted. The facade I had been maintaining, pretending that nothing was changing, it felt too thin. I could see how fragile it was, how close I was to unraveling. The idea of playing this game, pretending everything was fine while making small, calculated moves behind her back, it was exhausting. And yet, I knew that if I rushed this, if I confronted her too soon, I could lose everything. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience and precision. But patience was becoming harder to come by. The next few days were a blur. I continued with my plan, slowly, carefully building up my own financial security, making decisions on my own, and withdrawing a little more from the shared accounts each time. But with each move, the weight of my actions grew heavier. The guilt, the secrecy, the knowledge that I was walking a tightrope, it was becoming more and more difficult to bear. I found myself staring at my phone late at night, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Was this really the path I wanted to take? Was I just looking for a way out of a marriage that had once been full of love and promise? Or was I finally standing up for myself? I knew that I couldn't stay quiet forever. Sooner or later, she would notice. Sooner or later, everything would come to light, and I would have to face the consequences. But in that moment, as I stared at the screen in the dead of night, I realized something. This wasn't just about the money. This wasn't just about regaining control of my finances. It was about my life. It was about my identity. It was about reclaiming the person I had lost. I had allowed her to shape my world for so long, to dictate the course of our lives, and I had let it happen because I thought it was easier. Because I thought I was doing the right thing by being passive, by going along with her plans. But it wasn't right. And the longer I stayed in this state of submission, the more I was losing myself. That I needed to stand up, not just for the man I had been, but for the man I could still be. I had to push forward. There was no turning back. The next few days were filled with quiet confrontation. Small moments that hinted at something bigger. Her questions, her probing, they became more frequent. I could see it in her eyes. She knew something was different. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she could feel it. And it made her nervous. It was on a Wednesday evening, after dinner, when she finally said something that cut through the silence. "You've been acting strange lately," she said, her tone lighter than before. "Is there something going on? You've been distant." I could feel my pulse quicken. I knew this was it. This was the moment when everything could change. But I wasn't ready to face it head on just yet. Not without a plan. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Then, in a moment of calculated calm, I said, "I'm fine. Just been thinking a lot." She nodded, but her eyes were still watching me carefully, like a hawk. She didn't believe me. I could see it. She was watching for cracks, waiting for the moment when I would reveal the truth. But I wasn't ready to let her in. Not yet. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of something. Something big. I was playing a dangerous game, but it felt like the only option. If I kept playing by her rules, I would never get out. I would never be free. But breaking free came with its own set of risks. The thought of the confrontation, the fallout, the way everything could fall apart, it was terrifying. The next few weeks felt like a blur of motion. There were moments of clarity, moments where I felt confident in my decisions. But there were also moments of doubt, moments where the weight of what I was doing threatened to crush me. But with each passing day, I began to feel more sure of myself. More certain that I had made the right choice. I was no longer living in the shadows of her control. I was stepping into the light. And while I still wasn't sure exactly what that meant, I knew that I would never go back. The day was coming when I would have to confront her, when I would have to face the consequences of everything I had done. But that day wasn't today. Today, I was still building. Still preparing. Still reclaiming what was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance. It had been almost a month since I first started taking control of my life, and I could feel the shift inside me. There were moments when the sense of liberation was overwhelming. I could breathe a little easier, walk a little taller. But with each victory, the cost of that freedom seemed to climb higher. I was no longer just fighting to regain control, I was fighting to protect myself from the consequences of everything I had set in motion. That I had expected this, the guilt, the inner turmoil. But what I hadn't anticipated was how it would affect my relationship with her. The quiet tension that had once simmered beneath the surface had turned into something much more volatile. Every word, every glance, felt charged. It was like walking on eggshells, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even as everything around us was falling apart. She was beginning to notice. Her questions had grown sharper, her words more pointed. She wasn't asking anymore if I was okay, she was demanding to know what was going on. It came to a head one evening, after dinner. I had been quiet all through the meal, lost in my thoughts, barely touching my food. She had been talking, rambling on about something trivial, but I hadn't been listening. My mind had been elsewhere, planning the next move in my ever-growing web of decisions. I could feel her watching me. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, never left me. She wasn't buying my act anymore. "You're not even listening to me," she said, a slight edge to her voice. "What's going on with you?" I could feel my heart start to race. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment when the cracks in my facade would become undeniable. I put my fork down and looked at her. There was no point in pretending anymore. She knew something was wrong. And I had no choice but to face it head on. "I've been thinking," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've been thinking about a lot of things." She paused, her expression unreadable. "Like what?" Her tone had softened, but there was still a sharpness in her eyes. She was watching me closely, as if waiting for me to make the next move. That I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached for my drink, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch between us. It felt like a game of chicken, who would break first. I knew she was trying to push me into a corner, trying to get me to reveal what I had been hiding. But I wasn't ready. "Not yet." "I've been thinking about our relationship," I said finally. "About how things have changed." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker behind them, anger, frustration, maybe even fear. But it was gone before I could be sure. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice cold now, a hard edge creeping into it. "I mean," I began carefully, "that I've been feeling trapped. For a long time now. Like I don't have any control over my own life. Over anything." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I watched her closely, trying to gauge her reaction. But she didn't say anything right away. Instead, she stood up, walked over to the counter, and began washing the dishes. It was a calculated move. She was distancing herself, trying to regain some sense of control in a situation where she felt powerless. I could feel it, her need to control the space between us, to control the narrative. But I wasn't going to let her do that anymore. "I've been paying all the bills, making all the decisions," I continued, my voice steadier now. "And I've let you do all of it, thinking I was being a good partner, thinking I was helping. But I wasn't. I was just letting you control everything." She turned around sharply, her eyes wide, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. "What are you saying? Are you saying I've been controlling you?" The words were edged with something almost hurtful, but I wasn't about to back down. You've been making all the decisions, I said again, my voice growing more firm with each word. I've been sitting back, letting you do everything because I thought that's what a good husband does. But it's not. It's not okay. She stood there for a long moment, her back to me as she stared down at the dishes in her hands. I could tell she was trying to process what I had said, trying to piece together the implications. But instead of reacting immediately, she turned back toward me, her face now a mask of anger. So, what is this, then? She asked, her voice tight. You're telling me that everything I've done for us, for this family, is wrong? That I've been doing it all wrong? I could hear the hurt in her voice, and a part of me hated that I was causing it. But another part of me, maybe a larger part, was numb to it. I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't let myself be manipulated by her emotions anymore. No, I said, shaking my head. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that I've been wrong. I've let you carry all the weight, and I've done nothing. And I can't keep doing that. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and something else, betrayal, maybe. You think I've been carrying all the weight? What about everything I've done for us? What about this house, these kids? I know, I said quietly. I know you've done a lot. But I've been drowning. And I haven't done anything to help myself. To help us. There was a long pause, the silence stretching painfully between us. I could feel the tension, the unsaid words hanging in the air. She didn't know how to respond. I could see it in her eyes, she was struggling with what I had said. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually being seen. Like I was no longer just the man in the background, the one who let things happen to him. But as the silence deepened, I realized something else too. This wasn't just about me taking control. This was about her, too. She had her own role to play in all of this. And in the end, she would have to face it, just as I had to face mine. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. So what now? I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I had the answer. But I knew one thing, I couldn't go back. There was no going back to the way things were. And whatever happened next, whatever this confrontation led to, I had to face it. I don't know, I said finally. But I know I can't keep living like this. Not anymore. And for the first time, I realized that this was the turning point. This was the moment when everything changed. The moment when everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for, would either come crashing down, or it would finally set me free. The days that followed that conversation were the longest I had ever experienced. I could feel the shift in the air, the tension thickening every time we crossed paths. She was quieter, her movements more deliberate, as though she was waiting for me to make the next move. I knew that something had changed between us, but the worst part was the uncertainty of not knowing what that change would bring. At first, I thought I could handle it. I told myself that this was a necessary step, that I was finally breaking free from the life I had been suffocating under. But the weight of what I had said to her, the words that had broken the silence, kept echoing in my mind. What had I really done? What had I really achieved? I had thought that by finally speaking up, by asserting myself, I would feel empowered. But instead, I felt exposed. The walls I had spent so long building around myself were starting to crumble. The control I had been working so hard to regain felt fragile, like it could slip away from me at any moment. She didn't bring up the conversation again. At first, I was relieved by the silence, thinking that maybe she was processing things in her own way, giving me space to continue what I had started. But as the days went by, it became clear that the silence was just the calm before the storm. She was planning her response, and I had no idea what it would be. One afternoon, she approached me as I sat in the living room, scrolling through my phone. She stood in front of me, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in a way that made my stomach tighten. You think you can just walk in here and start changing everything? She asked, her voice icy that I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. The moment I had been dreading. She was no longer trying to play the role of the calm, understanding partner. The cracks were showing, and she was angry. I could feel the heat of her words, and I knew that no matter how carefully I tried to tread, I couldn't escape the confrontation anymore. I'm not changing everything, I said, trying to keep my voice even, my posture relaxed. I'm just taking responsibility for my part in this. I've let things get to this point, and I don't want to live like this anymore. She scoffed, shaking her head. Responsibility? You've let me control everything. You've been passive, complacent, and now you want to act like you've been the one suffering all along? Her words hit like a slap, stinging more than I cared to admit. I wanted to defend myself, to tell her that I wasn't blaming her, that I wasn't accusing her of being the villain in this story. But the truth was that I was angry, too. Angry at myself, angry at the situation we had built, and angry at the role I had played in it. And, deep down, I knew she felt the same way. I'm not saying it's all your fault, I said quietly. But I've been invisible in this marriage for so long. I've let you carry all the weight, and I've done nothing to change it. She stared at me for a long moment, her lips pressed tightly together. I could see the fury building behind her eyes, but there was something else there, too, hurt. And that hurt made everything more complicated. Do you really think I've been trying to control you? She asked, her voice softer now, though still laced with a tension I couldn't ignore. I don't know, I replied, my voice breaking slightly. Maybe not intentionally. But it feels like you've been making all the decisions, and I've just been going along with it. Like I didn't have a say. For the first time in what felt like forever, she dropped her arms to her sides, a deep sigh escaping her lips. The anger seemed to dissipate, replaced by something more vulnerable. Do you know how hard this has been for me? She asked quietly. Do you know how much I've tried to make this work, to make things better for us, for you? You think I haven't been struggling too? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. In that moment, I realized just how much I had failed to understand her. Just how much I had been blind to her own struggles. The world I had been so focused on, my own feelings of powerlessness, my need for control, had been so narrow, so one-sided. I had built a narrative in my mind that made me the victim, but in truth, she had been living her own version of that same story. I never said it wasn't hard for you, I said finally, my voice low. I'm not blaming you. But I'm tired of feeling like I'm nothing. Like I don't have any say in what happens to me. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked down at the floor, as though searching for the right words. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost distant. Maybe I don't know how to let go, she said, her tone fragile. Maybe I've been holding on to control because I didn't know what would happen if I didn't. I've always been the one who takes care of everything. I've always been the one who makes sure things are running smoothly. I didn't realize how much you needed to be a part of that. Her words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized how much we had both been playing roles, how we had each been trapped in our own version of what we thought the other needed. She had been controlling everything, yes, but it was because she thought she was doing it for us. She thought she was keeping us afloat. And I, in turn, had been sitting in the background, too afraid to step up, too comfortable with letting her take the reins. We had both been drowning in our own ways, and neither of us had known how to reach out to the other. I'm sorry, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I didn't realize how much you were carrying. She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I don't want this to be over. I don't want to lose you, but I don't know how to fix it. We stood there in silence for a long time, the weight of our conversation settling between us. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were both seeing each other, not just the roles we had played, but the people we really were beneath it all. The tension hadn't disappeared, not by any means. But in that moment, we had both admitted something important. We had been living in a state of quiet desperation, each of us trying to navigate a life we didn't fully understand anymore. And maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to rebuild it, together. But rebuilding didn't come without its challenges. The damage had already been done, and the path forward would require both of us to confront the hard truths that we had been avoiding for so long. The question was, were we both ready to face them? It was a week before we had another conversation about what had happened. The days stretched on in a quiet tension, with neither of us knowing what to say. what to do. The awkwardness between us was suffocating, like an unspoken barrier that kept us from connecting, from being who we once were. But beneath it all, there was a flicker of something, perhaps hope, perhaps fear, that neither of us could ignore. The question loomed over us: could we rebuild? Or was it too late? I found myself replaying that moment in my head over and over again. Her eyes, the softness in her voice, the vulnerability she had shown. It was as if, for the first time in years, we had been able to truly see each other. But seeing each other wasn't enough. We had to act on it. We had to be willing to do the work, to face the hard truths, to make sacrifices. And I didn't know if I could do that anymore. One afternoon, I walked into the living room to find her sitting on the couch, her hands resting in her lap. She looked up when I entered, and for the first time, I saw something other than the anger or the hurt in her eyes. There was a kind of sadness there, a kind of resignation. It broke my heart in a way I hadn't expected. "We need to talk," she said softly. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. I nodded, unsure of where this conversation would lead, but knowing it was necessary. "I know," I replied. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about what I've said. About everything." She looked at me for a long moment, and then, as if gathering the strength to continue, she spoke again. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice trembling just a little. "But I also don't want to keep living like this. I don't want to keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." Her words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt the weight of them settling in my chest. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I wasn't sure if I had the right to. Not yet. Not until we had dealt with everything that was broken between us. "I don't want to lose you either," I said quietly. "But I've been so lost in my own pain, my own anger, that I forgot about us. I forgot about what we had. And I don't know how to fix it. I don't know how to make it right." She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of it all was too much to carry. "I don't know how to fix it either," she whispered. "But maybe we don't need to fix everything right now. Maybe we just need to take it one step at a time." It was a simple thought, but it felt like a revelation. Maybe we didn't need to have all the answers. Maybe we just needed to start somewhere. We couldn't erase the past, couldn't undo the hurt, but we could make the decision to move forward, together. "I'm willing to try," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I want to try." And for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of relief. A sense of possibility. It wasn't going to be easy, no one had promised it would be, but it was a start. A small step in the right direction. The next few weeks were filled with quiet moments, honest conversations, and difficult decisions. We both made compromises. We both apologized, even when it was hard. But the road to rebuilding wasn't linear. There were setbacks, arguments, moments of doubt. Yet, through it all, there was something we hadn't had before, a sense of partnership. A sense that, despite everything, we were in this together. As the months passed, I started to realize that control was never the answer. I didn't need to control everything. I needed to let go, to trust, to be vulnerable. It was a difficult lesson, one I was still learning, but it was one I had to embrace if I wanted to move forward. So did she. We found new ways to communicate, to navigate the complexities of our relationship. There were still moments of frustration, still moments when I wondered if we had made a mistake. But there were also moments of laughter, moments of connection, moments that reminded me why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. But as time went on, something else became clear to me. This wasn't just about her. It was about me too. I had been so focused on her actions, her mistakes, her choices, that I had forgotten to look at my own. I had played a part in the breakdown of our relationship, just as much as she had. And that realization was humbling. At one point, we sat down together, both of us exhausted from a long day, and she turned to me with a small, weary smile. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked softly. I looked at her, my heart full of emotions I wasn't sure how to express. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I know that I want to try. I know that we're not perfect, but we're worth it." And for the first time, I believed it. For the first time, I believed that we could move forward, not because we had solved everything, but because we were willing to try. Final reflection. The journey had been long, full of mistakes, missteps, and realizations that cut deeper than I had ever imagined. But it had also been a journey of growth, of learning to let go of the need for control, and of rediscovering the importance of mutual respect and partnership. I had learned that no one, no matter how strong or capable they are, can carry everything alone. Relationships are built on shared responsibility, on compromise, and on vulnerability. In the end, I realized that no matter how broken things may seem, they're not beyond repair. The choice to rebuild, to begin again, is always there, even when it feels like the end. And while we may never go back to the way things were, that doesn't mean we can't build something even stronger. I wasn't trapped anymore. I had taken control of my own life, my own decisions, but more importantly, I had learned to share that control. And in doing so, I found the strength to face whatever came next, together.